We're honored this evening to have Dr. Elizabeth Elle, who's an associate professor in biosciences at Simon Fraser University. She's also the associate chair of the department. She's obviously a specialist in bees and pollination. And in addition to much of the outreach work that she does, she's a science advisor for the Environmental Youth Alliance's Pollination Paradise campaign. And she also serves on the Education Committee of the International Society for the Study of Evolution and the Science Advisory Committee for the World Wildlife Foundation. So we're very honored to have Elizabeth here this evening to tell us what the buzz is all about.
I think no one can resist the what the buzz is all about joke. I've heard it a lot in the last week. I usually don't resist it myself, to be honest. I know this seems really loud, but I guess we are videotaping this. It's going to be available online, and so that's why I'm wearing a microphone. And in addition to thanking Patricia and Laurie Wood, who's the person who's been checking you in the back, and the people in continuing studies, I have to thank Hartley Rosen, who's the person who first said I needed to do this. And I really enjoyed working with EYA, and I'll talk a little bit about what they're doing later. They're a great group. And thanks to all of you for coming here. I mean, we're all here. All of you sitting here are here to learn about bugs. And I think that's awesome, because usually that's not something that people go, yes, goody, I want to learn about bugs today. So thank you very much for coming. I obviously, since I'm standing here, think that bees are really interesting creatures. They're incredibly diverse. We have more than 800 species of native bees here in Canada. And frankly, they're also pretty attractive animals. These are orchid bees. Sorry, I'm stuttering there. These are orchid bees that were photographed by Sean McCann, who's a graduate student at SFU in South America. They're really stunningly beautiful animals, and I think even people who aren't as crazy about bugs as I am can appreciate that. But even our native bees, while maybe not as stunning as this metallic bee here, are, I don't know, kind of cute. This is this little boy I photographed in my backyard. And I know he's a boy. We'll talk about this later because of all that fur on his face. Even bees that don't pass the cuteness test are pretty interesting looking animals. I hope you had a chance to look at some of the bees that I had out in the lobby so that you could get an idea of the fact that not all bees look like black and yellow striped bumblebees. This indeed is a bee. Even though I sit here and I say, oh, okay, I'm really into bees and look how cool they are, you may be wondering, well, why should I really care about bees? And that's one of 4 questions that I'm going to try to answer for you today. I'm going to make a case for caring about our native pollinators, my plea for the bees' needs, by answering 4 questions for you. The first being, why should I care about bees? And then I'm going to talk about whether or not bees are in trouble. My guess is at least some of you are here because you've been reading the newspapers or listening to the radio and hearing that bees are in crisis. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. Then I'm going to take a moment and talk about what a bee is, because I find in my work that most people don't really know what bees are. And in fact, I'm frequently arguing with people. They'll say, well, that's not a bee. They'll look at the things I have outside and I'll say, actually, yes, it is. So I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about bees. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you can do to support bee diversity on your balconies, in your backyards, in your community gardens. And I'm going to start with the way I started my day today, with breakfast. So what I've got here is I've got my coffee, I've got my cranberry juice, got my granola with lots of fruit and nuts on it. I've got some toast with some jam on it. And what strikes me as someone whose background is actually plant ecology is what I'm really showing you right now is plant sex. You may not realize that, but all those fruits and nuts are the product of plant reproduction. And so that means that to make all those fruits and nuts and the coffee beans that went into my coffee, a pollen grain had to get from one plant to another plant. And in some plants, that's done by the wind or by the water, but in the vast majority of cases, it's done by some sort of animal. And if pollination is done by an animal, well, about 80% of the time, it's done by a bee. In a world without bees, my breakfast would look more like that. No coffee, which is really sad. No juice, no nuts, okay? No sunflower seeds or fruit in my granola. What would be left would be things that are wind pollinated, like the wheat that goes into my toast and the oats that go into my granola, and also my yogurt, because cows, last time I checked, didn't need a bee for sex. But the thing is that even cows, if they're fed things like alfalfa, alfalfa actually requires a bee pollinator. And so there are linkages throughout our food chain that go back to bees. In fact, about 1 out of every 3 bites we eat is thanks to a bee, and that includes obvious things like all the fruits and vegetables that are on here, as well as coffee, chocolate, very important, all sorts of beans like soybeans, pumpkins. Again, 1 out of every 3 bites you eat is thanks to a bee. But if our food supply isn't enough reason, and really it should be, then we can think about our economy here in Canada. There are statistics like this for the whole world, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Canada, and these numbers are for any given calendar year. Honeybees provide about $1.2 billion of pollination services for our crops in a given year. Now, in some of our provinces, honey production is how the honeybee keepers make most of their money. But in terms of what's happening in Canada as a whole, and what affects you and me, is this pollination service that has a big impact not only on our food supply, but on our economy. Bumblebees, you may not realize, are used extensively in greenhouse pollination of things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. So BC Hothouse has bumblebees in those hothouses. And just if we think about tomato production in Canada, about $288 million in any given year by bumblebees. Alfalfa bees, since I mentioned alfalfa before, contribute about $5 million to our economy every year. That's a lot. A lot that we owe to bugs, if I can say so. There's other reasons as well. I'm sorry, I forgot I was going to say this. So most of that pollination, as you can tell by the numbers, is done by the introduced European honeybee, Apis mellifera. This bee species has been hugely important in human societies for a very, very long time. There's some evidence that the Egyptians knew a lot about honeybees and used them in their agriculture. Honeybees, though, are a bit different from most other bee species. They have very different sorts of life cycles that actually make them excellent for use as managed pollinators. So, for example, they live in colonies of tens of thousands of bees. And those colonies naturally occur in things like hollow trees. So out in the wild, that's where you would find them. But that lifestyle makes them actually very well suited to being encouraged to make their colonies in artificial trees, if you will, these boxes that we use to put our honeybee colonies in. Once we get them in boxes, we can move them from place to place for pollination of our crops. And actually, this is something that's done extensively in the US and to some extent, of course, also here in Canada. So the trees in the background are almond trees. About 80% of the world's supply of almonds is grown in California. And almonds, not native to North America, bloom so early that there are no native pollinators that can really do the job. And so honeybees are shipped all the way across North America to be in California at the time of that bloom. That's pretty, I mean, just think about that for a minute. So they're going from the East Coast all the way to the Southwest. In Canada, we also move our bees from place to place, although not as extensively. They're used in the pollination of things like canola and many of our tree fruits. And again, they are moved from place to place to do this. And the fact that they live in these huge colonies where there's tons of animals in each of those little white boxes makes them really amenable to be used in managed pollination. The other thing that I should tell you, though, is that they're often put into crops like our blueberry crops, again, because we think we need those pollination services. But some research that was done here in BC and also in Eastern Canada and in the US has actually shown that they're not the best pollinators for some crops, like blueberries. It turns out that the blue orchard bee, the bumblebee, and the mining bee do a better job at moving pollen around in those fields. You need fewer of them to actually get the job done. But that doesn't mean that we can just rely on native pollinators, although increasingly, as I'll tell you, with problems with honeybee production, we are starting to rely on the natives more. The thing is that the native bees don't like landscapes that look like this. That's a canola field in Alberta. And it's a monoculture, and it's huge. So the native bees might be happy around the margins where they could use some of the canola and maybe use some other plants too. They like a diverse diet. But they're not going to fly all the way across that field to get to forage. And so they're not going to do pollination well in the middle of those fields. Honeybees, because we can put them out there in such large numbers, will be forced to go into the middle of the field. So for as long as we have large-scale agriculture like this, honeybees are going to continue to be very important for our food supply. The thing is that we know from work in canola and other crops that if you have greater plant diversity, and if we're talking about a field, that means weeds. It also means hedgerows or other wild areas around the field. If we have more plant diversity, we actually get more bee diversity, which means more different kinds of native bees. And that leads to higher yield. That was work that was done by a graduate student at Simon Fraser named Laura Morandin. And it's very interesting, but I don't know that it can really scale up to really large-scale agriculture. And that's for lots of reasons. One is that farmers don't like weeds in their fields. I get that. But I also think part of the issue is educating people about what the native what the native pollinators can do. Another example, actually, that I like to give is coffee production in Costa Rica. It turns out that farms that are nearby wild tropical rainforest, untouched rainforest, have about 20% higher yield than the farms that are further away from that rainforest. So that rainforest is providing pollination services basically for free to the farmer of that coffee field. And for one farm, the increase in their in how much they earned was $60,000 in 1 year. Native bees can actually do quite a lot of the pollination, but it really depends on the landscape that you're asking them to pollinate for you. Other reasons that you should care about bees have to do with wild areas. So I've been talking about agriculture and our food supply, but native bees are really, and other pollinators, are really important for our native plants. So my first couple of examples don't have anything to do with bees. There's some plants in Hawaii whose native pollinators have gone extinct. This is Brighamia. It actually grows on cliffs on these volcanoes, and its moth pollinator has gone extinct because of a loss of habitat and introduction of predators. And so this plant is no longer able to reproduce, except with the help of some really crazy scientists who rappel down the cliff and hand pollinate this thing every year. You're not going to find me doing it, but you know, at least somebody is. Another example, also from Hawaii, is Freycinetia, which was pollinated by 4 species of birds, 3 of which are now extinct in the wild. It's likely that this plant will also go extinct. And finally, a bee example, the field scabious daisy in Britain is pollinated only by a single specialist pollinator, and both are declining. And it's really hard in this particular example to know what started first, you know, which one was declining first, and that led to the other one's decline. But we actually know that habitat for both of them is decreasing. And habitat is kind of a theme here. Without the habitat that this plant lives in, that means there's no habitat for the bee to live in, and vice versa. And so loss of either of these two players will probably mean the extinction of the other. Now, as somebody, again, with a background in plant ecology, I find that lots of people think of plants as just the background. And what they really care about are big, warm fuzzies like bears, the charismatic megafauna. But the reality is, if you don't have bees, you don't have bears, because bees pollinate the blueberries that the bears eat. So bees are keeping those healthy ecosystems going, those natural areas going, and that supports these guys. So I'm making a pitch for the charismatic microfauna tonight. Okay, so hopefully, if you didn't come in here caring about bees, you do a little bit now. But then the second question is, are they in trouble? And this is something that was in the Vancouver Sun a little while back. There's been additional articles since then. In the US, there's enough concern that Haagen-Dazs has a special honeybee vanilla ice cream. I wish we had it here, actually, because it looks really cute. The thing about this ice cream, actually, is not that well, it doesn't have honeybees in it, although it does have honey. But what they're doing at Haagen-Dazs is they're actually donating money from every pint of the ice cream sold to honeybee research. And the reason is because they're concerned about declines of honeybees. So what's happening with honeybees? These are data from here in Canada. We don't have this year's data yet. Oh, sorry about that. We can see that over the last 2 years, in each year, we lost about 30% of our honeybee colonies. That's huge. That's huge. Losses are even worse in the United States, and they're similar in Europe. There's some disagreement about what we should call this. It seems to fall along political lines. So Europe calls it one thing, the US calls it another thing. In Canada, we don't really want to call it what the US calls it. But what the honeybee biologists that I talk to, that I collaborate with, tell me about is it's pretty safe to either call it colony collapse disorder, like they do in the US, or the new one is multiple stress disorder. Basically, what happens is over just a couple of days or a few weeks, the honeybees just disappear. The queen is left behind, and any brood, that's the young larvae that are developing, are still there, but the rest of the bees just go. And what's concerning about the fact that they just disappear is we don't have the little dead bodies to analyze. It's very difficult to figure out what's affecting them when they just fly out of the colony and don't come back. And my friend Rob Curry, who's at University of Manitoba, told me some of the reasons that have been put forth for this disappearance that he's heard. And they range from genetically modified organisms, extraterrestrials, to terrorist or Russian plots, to cell phone usage. And the last one actually has made the news a lot. I don't know if you guys have read it, and because there was actually a study done on it that showed some correlation between cell phone towers and lack of honeybees. But actually, that totally doesn't hold up. So even though it's hilarious, it's not true. The real causes behind colony collapse disorder are actually very complicated. It's several different things, most of which have been around for a long time, but seem to be interacting in new ways and causing lots of loss of our bees. So there are a couple of viruses, one of which is highly correlated with colony collapse disorder, and that's Israeli acute paralysis virus. The hard thing is that it has been around for a long time, and so scientists are trying to figure out, is there a new mutation? Is there something that's made it more virulent? Why is it so bad now? But it might be bad in part because of interaction with other things that negatively impact honeybees, one of which is a couple of species of parasitic mites. So that's a mite on the back of that honeybee. Again, these have been around for a long time, but they are growing increasingly resistant to the pest control methods that we use to control them in our honeybee colonies. And what Rob tells me, and some other honeybees have been quoted in the media, honeybee keepers have been, honeybees are not talking to the media, but the honeybee keepers are, and they are saying that they think that various forms of stress are contributing to the overall problem. The fact that we load these honeybees on trucks and move them across the continent, that they're perhaps being occasionally exposed to pesticides, that they are perhaps not having other things to forage on because we don't have very many wild areas. So honeybees too would like a varied diet, and so just subsisting on one kind of crop might not be so good for them. But what I can tell you is even though the situation is pretty dire, some of the best minds in the world are working on it. And both the Canadian government, the US government, and also European funding agencies are putting a lot of money towards this problem, as is Haagen-Dazs, to try to understand what's happening and see what we can do to fix it. Because as I was telling you, without the honeybee, our agricultural systems would be in serious trouble. But what I'm going to mostly focus on for the rest of my talk is not the honeybee, because there are bigger minds than mine that are working on this problem. I'm not a honeybee biologist. I'm a biodiversity specialist. I'm going to instead talk about some of our other native pollinators. And way before colony collapse disorder hit the press, this book, The Forgotten Pollinators, written by Steve Bookman and Gary Naban, came out back in 1997. And in this book, they made the case not just for bees, but for bats and birds and beetles and all other sorts of pollinators. And they said that they were very concerned about these pollinators disappearing. They were trying to make the same kind of case that Rachel Carson did in Silent Spring. Both of them had been working with pollinators for a long time, and they were noticing declines. Mostly, Gary was noticing it with bats that he was studying in the Sonoran Desert, and Steve is another collaborator of mine. He works with bees. And they tried to make the case that if we didn't pay attention, we'd have to worry about our food supply. And unfortunately, their predictions were somewhat correct, with colony collapse disorder showing up about a decade later. In 2006, the same year as colony collapse really hit the media and was really happening, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report on the status of pollinators in North America. The group of people that put this together included some well-known Canadian scientists, and they suggested that in addition to being concerned about honeybee losses, we really needed to be paying attention to other sorts of pollinators that might help to buffer our food supply in the face of loss of honeybees, and that also needed protection on their own right. So are those native bees in trouble? Well, I'm actually going to start again with a managed bee, and one of the reasons is because we just know more about them, because we keep them, we can count them, and it's a lot easier to study them than to study some of the wild ones. This is a native species of bumblebee. It's the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. It used to be one of our most common bees here in British Columbia. It was used extensively in our greenhouses to pollinate our greenhouse tomatoes. And it's got a similar sort of life history as honeybees, but instead of having tens of thousands of individuals in a colony, there's maybe a couple of hundred. And they'll happily make their little nests in a box, which is very cute. And you can put them into your greenhouses to pollinate your tomatoes. And the reason why they're used in greenhouses is because of the kind of flowers that tomatoes have. So the sex parts that the bee is hanging onto, those are called anthers. That's where the pollen is. And in a tomato, the pollen is up inside the anthers. It's kind of like, picture a salt shaker. And to get the salt out of the shaker, you have to shake it. Well, that bee is buzzing those anthers and shaking out the pollen. And bumblebees just do that a whole lot better than any other kind of bee. And that's true of just about everything in this family of plants. So this is the nightshade family, so it includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, all those sorts of things. Well, unfortunately, several years ago, we had a big crash in the population of the western bumblebee. And it's hard to figure this out retrospectively, but the main reason that scientists think this happened was because this bee started getting reared with the eastern bumblebee. And it picked up various diseases from the eastern bumblebee that it had never been exposed to before. And those diseases have completely decimated the western bumblebee populations. And because greenhouse pollinators can leave the greenhouse and go into natural areas, I've actually never seen one. I lived here in BC for 10 years now, and I've never seen what was once one of our most common bees. This prompted the Xerces Society to put out these wanted posters. So Xerces Society is a great source for information. It's spelled Xerces. And there are different color forms of the western bumblebee. That one's ours. Wanted for pollination of crops and wildflowers. If you see one, please let me know, because I'd like to see one too. I've only ever seen ones in museums. Other bumblebees are in trouble as well. And these are not managed bumblebees. But I guess you could think of that fuzzy black bumblebee kind of like that fuzzy black bear I showed you before. For a pollinator, they're incredibly well studied because they are more charismatic than some of the tiny little bees that were out in the lobby. I have to admit that too. And citizen scientists can identify them. So we actually have better data for bumblebees than anything else. In Britain, several species of bumblebee are in decline. The one on the left has not been seen in Britain since 1988. The one on the right is now its rarest bee. In both cases, the decline of these bees is linked to the decline of the plant species they rely on. And the one on the right is on red clover, which used to be planted extensively in farms and fields in Britain and really isn't anymore. And so there are now efforts in Britain to plant more red clover to help save the bumblebees. In Canada, in addition to the western bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee is in serious trouble. It may be extirpated from the Greater Toronto area. It used to be common, even just 5 or 6 years ago, so it's not just urbanization, there's something else that's going on. Both the rusty patch bumblebee and the western bumblebee have been proposed to the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada for listing under the Species at Risk Act, and hopefully those will get passed. But what about other bees? We have an amazing diversity of bees, as I told you. And are they in trouble as well? The hard thing is, as I said, they're not very well studied. So it's very difficult to say. Right now, we actually don't have strong data that says, yes, these bees are in trouble. But the reason why bumblebees are in trouble is because of habitat loss. And that should affect all bee species the same. And that's why I'm concerned about loss of our native bee species before we even know what some of them are. And that's why I want to talk to you about what bees are exactly. There are about 20,000 species of bees in the world, 5,000 in North America. And one thing that hopefully is coming out from some of these pictures I'm showing you is that they don't all look like the little fuzzy yellow and black striped thing that we tend to think of when we think of bees. And I think the reason we think that is because, well, bumblebees are bigger and we notice them a little bit more. And we also notice honeybees a lot, right? Because this is the bee that we tend to associate with pollination. For good reason, certainly, but it's not the only bee in town. Although the Bee Movie wouldn't have you know that. And actually, the Bee Movie has, actually, the people in my lab refused to go see it. And it's because it got so much of the biology of bees wrong. And so I'm gonna explode a few myths for you about bees, and then I'm gonna teach you a little bit about the different kinds of bees we have. So you can't rely on color, okay? You can't rely on how they look, but you can rely on lifestyle. So bees are vegetarians. So these two might look pretty similar to you if you're not a bug expert, but the one on the left is a bee and the one on the right is a wasp. The one on the left, its babies will eat pollen and nectar, so it's a vegetarian, but wasps feed their babies things like caterpillars, spiders, and other animals. That might not help you when you're trying to identify them on the wing, but you can also look for the skinny wasp waist that most wasps have. But just looking at color isn't going to quite do it for you. Telling a bee from a fly, well, you should be able to count the wings, but as these pictures show you, it's not always so easy to see how many wings they have. And I purposely chose a really good bee mimic there as my example of a fly, and that's the one on the left. And honestly, it fools me too. Okay, so I'll see it fly over and I'll be like, bee, and it's not. It's kind of embarrassing when you're supposed to be this expert on bees. But until I get close, I sometimes have trouble telling them apart because they're such good mimics. And these bulb flies, they have different color patterns depending on where they're living. So if they live with something like this red-tailed bee that has a red bum, they have a red bum. But if they live with bees that have yellow bums, they have yellow bums. Kind of cool. What you can look for if you're not able to count wings too easily is those big bug eyes. So if you look at the head of the fly, the big honking eyeballs, flies have big honking eyeballs and bees tend not to. So if you can't rely so much on how they look, what else can I tell you about bees? Well, first of all, they're not like Jerry Seinfeld in Bee Movie. In fact, this is so wrong on so many levels. Although it's really cute. And actually, I don't even care that he's only got 4 legs. That's fine. I know people, when the ant movies came out, they didn't like that. That's fine. The problem is he's a boy. So with honeybees and other bees, boys don't do the pollinating. No. Boys don't do any of the work. Girls do. The boys are only good for sex. And you all think I'm like making this up, but it's true. And so what you find in these colonies of things like bumblebees and honeybees, it's all daughters that are being produced. They're all sisters of each other, okay? And they do all the work. The boys are not out there collecting pollen and bringing it back. And this is a problem for some of the solitary ones because that means they don't have a hive to go home to. They don't have a nest. So that means the boys have nowhere to sleep. But it can be really cute. So that means they'll sleep in little groups in flowers. That's a tulip flower at dusk, which is why it's so overexposed. So you might see a little pile of bees in a flower. It's probably a bunch of boys that are just homeless for the night. The other thing you might see is a bee hanging onto a twig with its mandibles so that they don't fall off when they're asleep in the middle of the night. Those are all bees as well. I love the upside down one. I mean, that's so cute. I think boy bees are adorable, even if they don't do any of the work. The thing that you also should know about boy bees is that they can't sting. They don't have the equipment, so they're not capable of stinging. And that's good news. It's a good party trick, because if you could tell a boy bee from a girl bee, you could grab one with your hands and act all tough, and actually you're in no danger whatsoever. So how do you tell boys and girls apart? Well, I said a little bit about this before. Boy bees have facial hair, okay? So the boy bee is on the right in the next 3 slides, and he's got kind of a little yellow face and a little mustache, and he also has longer antennae, especially this one. It's a longhorn bee. This is a leaf-cutting bee. Great facial hair on that boy on the right, don't you think? Really fuzzy face. And here, and this is a mining bee, just like a little brush mustache. Facial hair equals boy, okay? But as long as we're talking about stinging, everybody seems to know, well, bees can only sting you once and then they die. That's true for honeybees, but not for other kinds of bees. So honeybees, remember, live in colonies of tens of thousands of bees. They're all their sisters, okay? That's a lot that they need to protect. If you go messing with them, they're gonna get you, okay? And if you mess with their colony, okay? That doesn't mean that if you're walking by, you're in trouble. But if you go in and mess with them the way keepers have to, well, why do you think they wear all that protective stuff, right? So their venom is actually pretty strong stuff. And it's true that their stinger will come out when they sting you. And by ripping out part of their abdomen, those honeybees will die afterwards. Why does it rip out and stick in you? Well, it keeps pumping the venom into you. But other bees don't do that. And they could sting you as many times as they wanted to. They could sting you way more than an individual honeybee can. But their venom tends to be not so bad, and really, they're just not that into you. I work with bees all the time. I am almost never stung. I'm not going to say never, but I have never been stung in my backyard or while walking through a field full of flowers and bees. I've never in those instances. When I've gotten stung, it's because I've been like, cool bee, and I don't have my net, and I grab it with my hands. And I'm kind of asking for it in that case. If you don't go grabbing a female bee, your chances of getting stung are slim to none. Okay. I said this already. We have more than 20,000 species of bees in the world, 5,000 in North America, 800 or more in Canada. I can't give you a number for BC because I'm the only one doing it, and I'm still learning, okay? But I've been working in the Garry Oak ecosystem, which is one of Canada's rarest ecosystems. It's found on Vancouver Island. We have more than 130 species identified to date and counting. And one of them is new to science. It's never been described by a taxonomist before. And this is why, one of the reasons why I'm concerned about bee declines, because we don't even know what we have yet, and we may be losing species. There are 4 very abundant families of bees here in BC. There's more than that, but these are the ones that you might run into in your yard. And they include the social bees, which are bumblebees and honeybees. Remember, honeybees are introduced, but bumblebees are native. The mining and sweat bees, which I put together because they can be difficult to tell apart, and they have very similar lifestyles, and the mason and leafcutter bees. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each of those families so that you can appreciate how neat they are. If you want to tell those families apart, the first thing you have to do is check the bee's knees, okay? And you thought that saying meant nothing. No, the bee's knees are actually where all the action is, well, at least in some families. So if we look at the bee's knees, mining bees, and sweat bees too, put pollen all the way up their legs to their waist, way up their legs. So you can see all that yellow stuff goes right up. Mason bees, however, put their pollen up under their bum, okay? And bumblebees, just like honeybees, put it in a little ball on their legs. So everybody thinks that all bees do it like bumblebees and honeybees because we think those are the only bees in the world, but actually other bees do it in different ways. So if you see where they put their pollen loads, you might have an idea of what kind of bee they are. So bumblebees are social bees, just like honeybees are, and I said they live in colonies of a couple of hundred bees over the course of a season. The queens come out in spring, and they've been out for several weeks here in the Lower Mainland. They tend to be very large bees. They build a nest, and they begin provisioning their nests for young. This is what a nest looks like. That's actually the eastern bumblebee. So each of those balls that looks like a piece of popcorn or something, that's a single cell. And in there, there's pollen and nectar and a single egg that develops into a baby bee. The workers come out and they begin to help provision, and the first workers are tiny relative to the bumblebees. And you might think they're different species, but if they have the same color pattern, they're actually the same kind of bee. Eventually, the queen will stop leaving the nest, and she just becomes a baby factory for the rest of her life. And not until the end of summer are males produced, and the queens that will mate and form the next generation. So you won't see male bumblebees right now. So it's safer to just call them all she, and don't try grabbing them with your hands right now. Don't try that trick, because there's not a whole lot of males out right now. So they're only made mostly in late summer. They mate, the queens overwinter, and everybody else dies, doesn't live through the winter. That's different from honeybees, which are perennial. Like a perennial plant, they can live for many years, those colonies. There are 3 really common bumblebees that there's going to be a test later. I'm going to teach you to identify. But they're they're actually really easy. They're really distinctive. So this is the red-tailed bee. And it's, well, can you guess why it's called that? Has a really bright red bum, okay? And there's nothing else that's quite as red as this thing in the springtime. The yellow-fronted bee is the one that breaks my rule of only the things with yellow fuzz on their face are males. So maybe if you see something that looks like this, don't grab it with your hands. So it has a yellow face and a little yellow stripe on her bum. And the rest of her is like this velvety black. They're beautiful bees. Has the lovely scientific name of Vosnesenskii. It's named after a Russian entomologist. And then there's the 2-ranked bee, which I don't like as a common name, but I thought about making up something cuter, but I decided that wouldn't be fair. But Bombus bifarius, I don't have a great picture of. It looks a bit like the red-tailed bee, but it's not as red on the bum. There's, in addition to having those orange stripes, it has yellow stripes too. And the 2 in the name and the bi in the scientific name refers to the fact that there's two little spots on the back. That's the way you can remember it anyway. So those 3 are all out now. I've seen them all foraging on plants already. Mining bees and sweat bees, I told you, are very similar, and they're really different from the social bees. First of all, most of them are not social. They're what we call solitary bees. So that means a single female makes a nest. They live mostly in the ground, hence the name mining bee. Right? So they dig holes in the ground to live in. The males come out first, so the first thing you see for these guys are males, and I've been seeing lots of males around. And they patrol for females. It's great. They fly around close to the ground and over patches of flowers just looking for females, and if they see one, they pounce on her. And that's because they don't live very long. So after they mate, not long after, the males they're toast. They're gone. And the females then go on to build a nest, provision it, and raise the offspring. They only lay about 20 or 30 eggs in their whole life, so they only make 2 or 3 nest cells. And they only live 3 to 5 weeks, so they're not alive very long. And this is what their nest can look like from above ground. So this was at actually one of my field sites. These are some sweat bees. You might see these little piles of soil and think, oh, those are ants, but they're not. They're actually bees. And I've seen some of these starting to be formed in places where the ground is kind of hard packed, like on paths with people who have lawns like mine that aren't well fertilized and watered. Then you might get some of these things making homes in your lawn. And this is what the nests look like from inside. I didn't take these pictures. They're taken by someone at UC Davis. And it's really cool because it shows you've got this hole in the ground, and you can see how it's kind of shiny. That's because bees will waterproof their nests because, like I said, they only live 3 to 5 weeks, and then that's it for that species for the whole year. So the babies will undergo their metamorphosis underground, but they don't come out until next spring. So those nests have to be pretty waterproof in this part of the world. So she collects pollen, she provisions the nest, and she lays a single egg on each hole. So you'll see them, they're like little terriers building these holes and throwing the dirt out of the holes. It's really great. Sweat bees do the same thing. And then there's the masons and leaf cutters. So remember, these are the ones with the pollen up under their bum. These are also solitary bees, so they have essentially the same life cycle as what I was just telling you. Males are out first, they mate with the females go ahead and do all the work and raise the babies. But in this case, they live in wood, so that can be in a stump. They can either use existing holes, or some of them will make additional holes. They also live sometimes in twigs, so in hollowed out twigs. So some of our native plant species, like Elderberry have hollow twigs, and so they can live in dead twigs. The family name in Latin is Megachilidae, which is easy to remember because it means big teeth. And no, they're not going to bite you, although, again, because I grabbed them with my hand, I have had that wonderful experience. And it did work. I mean, it made me drop her, so that's what she wanted. But actually, what those big jaws are for is for making their nests, and they have really cool nests. So leafcutter bees actually use pieces of leaf to line their nest. So this is a bee using those big jaws to cut a hole in a leaf. Then she carries it to her nest. This one's trying to make a nest in a piece of garden hose. Perhaps not the best idea. And then up on top is the way the nest looks with all these bits of leaf rolled around it. This is a phlox plant from my garden. They've also done this to fuchsias. But see, I think that looks lovely. If you see something like this, don't immediately think it's a caterpillar that's going to kill your plant. This is not going to have any long-term negative impact on that phlox plant. It flowered just fine. They also use petals sometimes, like rose petals. Again, I tend to think that's cute. Hopefully you will too. Also in this family are carder bees, and this particular one has been introduced to North America. So we do have a few species that have been introduced accidentally to North America. They're called carder bees if you've ever heard of carding wool. Right? So they're into plant hairs. So this is on a hanging planter that I had in my yard, and she's collecting the plant hairs off of that fuzzy plant that she's on. And you can see there's like a ball of fur there. She's been scraping that off with her jaws and collecting it to bring back home and line her nest with. And so what you see with carder bees is the males will defend plants that have fur on them, like lamb's ears. So he'll defend that plant. He'll chase all other bees away, bigger bees than him, bumblebees, honeybees. He'll chase them all away, say, this is my plant. And when the female comes, he pounces on her. Are we detecting a theme? It's great, actually. So this is also a party trick, at least at my house. So let's go look at the bee, because he has a little territory in my yard. Okay, and then there's the mason bees. So masons collect mud. I forgot to put a circle around her jaws. Can you see those two black jaws hanging down around that ball of mud? So they collect mud. She's flying that ball of mud back to her home. So they need those jaws just to hold this stuff. Okay. And they can happily make nest cells in anything that's a tube. So you can actually put out something for them to nest in. So these are bits of bamboo, a wooden nest block, and then a close-up of what their nest looks like. So in between all that bright orange pollen, there's these bits of mud, and that's why they're called mason bees. Now, the blue orchard mason bee is something that many people in this room probably know about, because it's the one that will happily live in a little condo that you put out for it. It's really an excellent pollinator of fruit trees, and it's actually managed for fruit tree pollination in various parts of North America. And when I say fruit trees, I mean things like cherries and apples. And they're very tame. There's a little male sitting on I think it's Hartley's thumb. At least he took the picture and sent it to me, a female on a flower. They're very tame bees. So again, it's not that they can't sting, but they're so tame. And these condos are something that the Environmental Youth Alliance has been encouraging people to put out in their gardens. In response to concern about declines in bee species, Hartley Rosen and the Environmental Youth Alliance have started up this project to put condos in people's yards, and they also encourage people to plant bee-friendly gardens. And this year they've expanded, and they've started putting these big structures into the parks. They're fabulous. I put some of their sponsors things on here. They've gotten sponsorships from all sorts of organizations, and it's really a great project. Because EYA is focused on youth, all these really interesting mega condos were built by students at different high schools to be put in places like Jericho Park and Stanley Park. And it's a great project, not just because it's good for the bees, but because I think it's been educating so many people about the importance of pollinators for our food supply and the things that we can do in our own yards to support them. It's a great project. And it's because the mason bees are so amenable to living in something like this that you can do this. It's great. I just have to briefly say that, yes, okay, there are other things to do pollination. Can I go on now? No, I'm just kidding. I am definitely one of those people that gardens for backyard biodiversity. I'm so excited when my rufous hummingbirds come back to my yard. We also have butterflies that are beautiful additions to our gardens. Hoverflies, I think, are a bit misunderstood. They often are bee mimics, and they're also really great to have in your garden because their offspring are great biological control agents. They eat aphids, so they're a great thing to encourage in your garden. The reality is, though, that even though all these things will visit various flowers and they will do some pollination, they're just not doing as much as the bees are. And that's because bees are provisioning nests for young. So they're collecting pollen actively. They're making way more visits to go to those plants than any other animal is. These are just feeding themselves. And so by doing that, they're going to be moving a lot more pollen around. So what can you do? I know. Those are dandelions. Actually, dandelions are great for bees. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you can do in your gardens. And I'm basing this both on my own observations of my garden, my work, my scientific hat, the other side of me that's actually doing research on bees, and also on the work of two great young women, Desiree Chamasi and Elise Miro, who as high school students started what they called the Once Upon a Bee project. They wound up eventually publishing their work in the Canadian Entomologist, which is pretty awesome for people who started this as high school students. What Desiree and Elise did was they went to various parts of the Lower Mainland. They went to botanical gardens, they went to community gardens, they went to just people's backyards and to waste places, and they sampled the bees to see what kinds of plants supported the largest bee populations or the most diverse bee populations. And yes, the dandelion actually supports really good diverse bee populations. And actually, they weren't the first people to say this, but I just love the way that they did it. There are a lot of pollination biologists like myself that are trying to get people who have orchards, for example, to leave weeds like dandelions in between their rows. That dandelion's not going to hurt their cherry tree, but it might support the pollinators outside of that cherry tree bloom and keep them in the field. What I'm not really going to talk about too much is the things that you're growing to feed yourself. Anything that you are growing to feed yourself is food for a bee. And I'm going to assume that you might put your cherry or your apple trees, your strawberries, your beans, your zucchini, and tomatoes. You have those perhaps in your gardens already. But what I'm going to talk about more is what to have also in your garden that maybe is blooming before or after these things so that you have continuous bloom to support the bees. Because the thing is, as I was saying before, actually I might have forgotten to say this and I apologize if I did, most crop plants only flower for a week or two. It's not true of, say, tomatoes, but cherry tree blossoms don't last very long. That canola bloom lasts maybe a week. And I told you that most solitary bees live 3 to 5 weeks. So they need food for that entire period. And so I'm going to actually talk about other things you can plant in your garden so that you'll have pollinators around to make food for you. Okay, so here's my 4 rules. One is you want to extend bloom times as long as possible. And as somebody who's really into being a 4-season gardener myself, this is just good anyway, because it's just more fun to have things blooming when other people don't. No, I don't mean it. But especially early, it's really important because what Elise and Desiree found was that the most diverse bee populations here in the Lower Mainland are spring bees. Okay, so we have a lot of spring bees, and they tend to come out as soon as the weather gets warm. This year, it was a cold spring, but in warmer springs, the bees might come out before there are native plants or your cherry trees for them to forage on. And so having things for them to eat early is really important. Later, it's easy. Like having things blooming in summer is easy, but having things in early spring is very important. I want you to choose bee-friendly plants, and in addition to dandelion, I'm going to give you a bunch of suggestions about that. It's important not to use pesticides, especially pesticides that act against ants. And the reason I say that is because ants and bees are closely related. And so anything that will kill an ant is going to hurt your bees. And I'd like you to consider, if you're not part of the EYA Pollinators Paradise campaign, putting a nest box in your yard. And it can be for mason bees, or you could actually make them for bumblebees, or even just leave some places in your yard where you don't dig it up too often. Bumblebees like things like abandoned mouse houses. So I mean, maybe you don't want the mice, but when they leave, then you've got a ready-made home for a bumblebee, which is a cool thing. All right. So some suggestions for you. Heather is kind of a no-brainer, right? It's the first thing that flowers around here, and it's really pretty. It's the first thing of spring. It sometimes flowers as early as February. And the thing about this plant is, heather, it's part of the heath family, and which has the unfortunate scientific name of Ericaceae, which I know you're not going to remember, but hopefully you can remember heath. Members of this family are great things to plant for bees. Heather is not a native plant species, but it is one of the earliest things to bloom. It has great pollen and nectar resources. It's a good thing to have even in a pot in your garden. Similarly, I encourage you to plant lily of the valley bush, which is Pieris japonica. I know some garden designers that hate this. It's so boring. Everybody has it. It's like, I want 5 of them because there's 2 mason bees on that thing, and that's on my campus, actually, up in Burnaby Mountain. So this is one of those, if you build it, they will come. If you have this plant in your garden, you will have bees in your garden. And part of the reason is there's nothing else flowering, really, when this thing starts flowering. And it tends to flower right around the same time as the blue orchard mason bee starts to emerge. The two seem to be fairly synchronized, so it's a good thing to have in your garden. And I have grown this in a pot, so you can put it on your balcony. But wherever possible, I actually want to encourage you to grow some of our native plants. So also in the heath family, look at these flowers. They look just like the heather flower, okay? And Bearberry has the same kind of flower. Also in the heath family, a great ground cover, especially for dry areas. A wonderful native plant. Bees love it. Also, we have 2 native species of rhododendrons that you could consider. They're in the same plant family. But one thing is, you could probably plant just about any rhododendron, even though they're not native, they're not going to become a pest. They're not going to be invasive. And these are magnets for bees in the springtime. Great way to extend the bloom. Other native plants to consider, blooming right now is Oregon grape. Beautiful yellow flowers this time of year. Usually it's earlier than this, but this year it's now. Bees love that. They also love our native red flowering currant, and EYA brought one and has it sitting outside in the lobby. Many of us plant this to attract hummingbirds to our garden. It is one of those early flowering things that hummingbirds love. It's also a great, really beautiful native shrub that bees love as well. Another native to consider is our native roses. We have 2 species that are native. Bees love anything that has that much pollen sticking out in the breeze like that. And the thing is, even if you don't grow our native rose, consider an old-fashioned rose, one that looks kind of like this, with not too many petals and the sex bits out there for everyone to see, as opposed to one of our fancier, kind of more long-stem rose types. Because you can see the difference, and that's what a bee will see. I think ocean spray is underappreciated. Another native shrub, there is a little bee on it. Something that's not native to BC, but native to the West Coast is the California lilac. And it's a beautiful shrub. If you've seen it in bloom, beautiful covered blue flowers, covered usually with bees. I need to be a much better photographer to catch all the little tiny ones that are usually all over it. It just buzzes. And I had it right next to my front door, never got stung. So again, don't be afraid of our bees. Also introduced, but one thing that the Once Upon a Bee girls found to be very attractive to bees is cotoneaster. Okay? Has some of the highest populations of bees visiting it. And it gives you pretty berries in the winter. In the middle of summer, I suggest having at least 1 or 2 mints in your garden. This is bee balm. So you can guess that bees like it. Also known as bergamot or monarda. So this is what gives its flavor to Earl Grey tea. And there are red flower ones too that hummingbirds quite love in my garden. Anything in the mint family. How do you know the mint family? It's got a square stem. Okay, so you can feel the stem is square. Also in the mint family are some of our really popular herbs like lavender. Any kind of lavender will be a bee magnet. Other Mediterranean herbs like that, rosemary, thyme, oregano, this has a honeybee on it, okay? Anything like that will be attractive to bees. I'd say basil, but usually we don't let basil flower. We usually eat it all up before it gets that big. And the third plant family I'll recommend to you is the sunflower family. So this is daisies and asters. This is that cute little, that's the leafcutter bee again that I showed you earlier. He's just so cute. This is a green metallic bee on a sunflower, photo by another grad student at SFU, Mel Hart. That is, I'm just remembering the scientific name. That's an anthophorid bee, sorry. I think they're called digger bees on Coreopsis. Another leafcutter, a teeny tiny bee. Yes, that is a bee on a daisy. Basically, anything that looks kind of like a daisy is going to be very attractive to bees. Tons of pollen and also lots of nectar. I could go on. I'm into gardening. I'm into bees, you know. The best thing you can do is go to a garden center and hang out for a few minutes and see what the bees tell you they like. That's what I do a little bit too often, to my husband's chagrin. And seriously, if it's a good garden center, not using a lot of pesticides, the bees will tell you what they want you to take home, which is very useful. But you only have to remember 3 plant families. For early, you want the heaths. For mid, you want the mints. Mid to late, you want the sunflowers. There are some sunflowers that actually bloom early. All of these things are very attractive to bees. If you plant these things near your vegetables and your cherry trees and so on, you're going to be supporting bee populations that will help to make fruit and other things for you to eat in your garden. One word of caution for see what the bees like in the garden center. Please don't plant something that's going to be a pest. Bees love Himalayan blackberry, and admit it, you guys probably do too, but not in wild places or in your yard. It's a terrible invasive plant. It's almost impossible to eradicate. Himalayan balsam, also known as policeman's helmet or Bobby's helmet, is becoming a pest in wetlands here in the lower mainland. The Centaurea, I don't know that it's becoming a pest so much. It's a kind of bachelor's buttons, but I used to have it in my yard because the bees told me they liked it, so I brought some home. But then I started noticing it in other places, in wild places, in some of the places I work, in the Garryoke ecosystem, and I realized that it has the potential to be an invader, so I don't recommend it. Basically, if you see things escaping, they're not good things. I have to say, though, dandelions, they like lawns, but you never find them in wild, natural habitats. Dandelions are actually very good things, at least for bees. Okay. So just a few take-home messages for tonight. Remember that lovely statement, 1 out of 3 bites you eat is thanks to a bee. And we should all thank the bees for our food supply. The second thing is, we know honeybees are in trouble. We also know that bumblebees are in decline as well. And my interpretation of that information is that likely some of our other native bees are in trouble. The good news is, for the native bees anyway, there's something that we all can do. You can put pots of things that bloom on your balconies, in your community gardens. You can landscape your backyard with bee-friendly plants, and that will all help to support wild bee populations. Thanks.